He had it all: fortune, success, and a perfect wife, until his body began to fail. Her care seemed like love, but it hid a slow, cruel, and almost imperceptible plan. Only his mother saw through the charade and acted in silence to prevent an ending that was already written. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. New York City was pulsing that September morning with its usual intensity. The congested traffic on Park Avenue mirrored the frantic routine of millions of people chasing their goals, their dreams, their daily battles. Among them was Michael Thompson, a 41-year-old man who had built a quiet empire in the real estate market. He wasn't the type of businessman who appeared on magazine covers or made a point of attending social events. He preferred discretion, a job well done, the solidity of numbers that didn't lie. Sitting in the leather armchair of his office on the 23rd floor of a commercial high-rise on the Upper East Side, Michael watched the city through the expansive window. From there, New York seemed small, controllable, almost docile. Comforting illusion for someone who knew that, down below, nothing was truly controllable. He had learned that over 20 years in the market. He had started as a real estate agent, knocking on doors, facing rejections, learning to read people and situations. Today, his company managed high-end developments in several of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Success hadn't come from luck, but from persistence, strategic vision, and an unusual ability to predict trends. Married for 13 years to Christina, Michael believed he had found the ideal partner. She was beautiful, elegant, and knew how to navigate the social circles he preferred to avoid. She was 38 with always impeccable brown hair, a smile that charmed at first sight, and a posture that exuded sophistication. They met at a charity gala at the New York Athletic Club, where she worked in public relations for a jewelry brand. Michael was captivated by the way she handled conversations, the ease with which she moved between different groups, the intelligence she showed when talking about art, culture, and business. Christina, in turn, seemed genuinely interested in this discreet man who, despite not being flashy, radiated stability and security. The wedding took place 6 months later, in an intimate ceremony at a chapel at a charming resort in the Hudson Valley. Helen, Michael's mother, was there, of course, a 65-year-old woman, widowed for a decade, who had raised her son alone after her husband died prematurely from heart complications. She was the type of person who observed more than she spoke, who understood silences, and who had a keen instinct for reading people. During the ceremony, while everyone smiled and toasted the couple's happiness, Helen kept a watchful eye, not suspicious but careful. After all, he was her only son, her greatest treasure, and she knew every nuance of his personality. The first years of the marriage were peaceful. Michael continued to expand his business, and Christina took on an important role in managing the couple's social life. She organized dinners for important clients, attended charity events, and decorated their home, a spacious modern townhouse in Tribeca. To outsiders, she was the perfect wife for a successful man. Attentive, present, always concerned about her husband's well-being. Michael considered himself lucky. He wasn't a man of many romantic words, but he showed affection in other ways. Carefully chosen gifts, surprise trips, attention to details she mentioned wanting. Helen visited the couple regularly. Sunday lunches, afternoon coffees during the week, conversations about everyday things. She lived alone in a comfortable apartment on the Upper West Side, close enough to be present, distant enough not to interfere. Michael always insisted she accept more substantial financial help, but she politely refused. She had her retirement, her savings, and most importantly, her independence. What really mattered to Helen was being nearby, keeping up with her son's life, making sure he was okay. And he seemed to be, at least for the first few years. But in the last 6 months, something had started to change. At first, the signs were subtle. Michael casually mentioned during a Sunday lunch that he'd been feeling more tired. Nothing alarming, just a persistent fatigue that didn't go away even after a full night's sleep. Christina immediately showed concern, suggesting he see a doctor, slow down at work, take better care of his health. Michael agreed but didn't think much of it. After all, he was managing 3 developments simultaneously, dealing with suppliers, buyers, and bureaucratic issues. It was natural to feel exhausted. Helen noticed but said nothing at that moment. She watched her son carefully. He really did look more worn out. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced, his posture slightly stooped, as if carrying his own body required extra effort. During the meal, she noticed he ate little. Christina, sitting beside him, gently insisted he finish his plate, arguing that he wasn't eating well. Michael smiled, said he wasn't very hungry, but ended up eating a few more bites so as not to worry her. In the following weeks, the symptoms intensified. Michael started having small memory lapses. He forgot appointments he had made, lost his train of thought in the middle of meetings, had to reread emails several times to process the content. This irritated him deeply. He had always had an excellent memory, a rare ability to retain complex information and use it strategically. Now he felt as if there were a constant fog over his thoughts, hindering the mental clarity that had always set him apart. Christina redoubled her care. She began preparing Michael's meals personally, claiming that poor nutrition might be contributing to the problem. She researched specific recipes, bought organic ingredients, and took great care in presenting the dishes. Every night she served dinner with a loving smile, sat beside him, and watched every bite. If he showed a lack of appetite, she would insist sweetly, saying he needed to get stronger, that his body was asking for nutrients. Michael, touched by his wife's dedication, forced himself to eat, even when his stomach seemed to reject any food. Helen started visiting more frequently, not invasively, but with the excuse of being in the neighborhood, wanting to enjoy her son's company, or bringing some food she had prepared. Christina always received her politely, but there was something in the way her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were calculating every move, every word spoken. Helen picked up on these signals. As an experienced woman, she knew the difference between genuine hospitality and forced courtesy. During one of these visits, a dinner where Helen showed up unannounced, she was able to observe the dynamic between the couple more closely. Michael was visibly worn out, his face thinner, his skin slightly grayish. Christina served the meal with her usual care, but Helen noticed something curious. Every time she, the mother-in-law, made a comment or diverted Christina's attention, Michael would stop eating. When the attention returned to him, Christina would resume her gentle insistence that he continue. It seemed like a pattern, a subtle choreography that repeated itself. Helen decided to conduct a discreet test. In the middle of dinner, she got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. Christina offered to go, but she refused, saying she wanted to stretch her legs. She used the moment to observe the arrangement of the plates on the counter. There were 3 prepared plates, but she noticed that Michael's had a slightly different presentation. The sauce was thicker, the color a bit darker. It could have just been a matter of portioning, but something about it bothered her. She returned to the table without saying anything, continued the conversation naturally, but her instincts were on high alert. In the following days, Michael got worse. In addition to the fatigue and memory lapses, he began to feel a deep apathy. Things that once gave him pleasure, like monitoring new projects, visiting construction sites, and negotiating contracts, now seemed like overwhelming tasks. He would come home in the middle of the afternoon, something unthinkable for someone who used to work until the early evening. Christina was always there, waiting with tea, a light meal and words of comfort. She said he was burning out, that he needed to rest, that maybe it was time to delegate more responsibilities. Michael listened and agreed, feeling too weak to argue. Helen, upon hearing this during a call from her son, felt a tightness in her chest. Something was deeply wrong. Michael was a strong, healthy, disciplined man. This rapid deterioration didn't make sense. She tried to suggest he see a doctor, get a full checkup. He said Christina had already scheduled appointments, that he was being monitored, that the doctors couldn't find anything serious, just signs of severe stress, and recommended rest. Helen wasn't convinced. She decided she needed to observe more closely. She started calling Michael at different times, always with simple excuses. She'd ask about a recipe, a TV show, a news story she'd seen. The goal was to assess his mental state, to see if the memory lapses were continuing, if the mental confusion was increasing. And it was. Michael would repeat information he had already given, forget recent conversations, and speak more slowly as if it took extra effort to organize his thoughts. This frightened her. One afternoon, Helen decided to make an unexpected visit. She rang the doorbell of the Tribeca townhouse without warning. Christina answered, clearly surprised, but maintained her composure and polite smile. She said Michael was resting in the bedroom, that he had come home early from the office because he wasn't feeling well. Helen insisted on seeing him. Christina hesitated for a few seconds, but there was no way to refuse without seeming strange. She led her mother-in-law to the bedroom. Michael was lying down, his eyes half closed, his face pale. Upon seeing his mother, he made an effort to smile, but the gesture seemed to take all his energy. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, holding her son's hand. It was cold, slightly trembling. She asked simple questions, observed his answers. Michael was clearly confused, had difficulty concentrating, and seemed to be floating in a state between waking and sleeping. Christina, standing by the door, watched everything with an expression that tried to convey concern, but, to Helen's sharp eyes, revealed something more like impatience. Helen asked what he had eaten that day. Michael could barely remember. Christina answered for him, detailing each meal with almost excessive precision. Breakfast with fruit and yogurt, a light lunch with vegetables and chicken, an afternoon snack with fresh juice, all prepared by her, all carefully chosen. Helen thanked her for the information, but something about that precision sounded false. It was as if Christina were reciting a script, not recalling natural events. Before leaving, Helen asked for a glass of water. Christina went to get it, and in that brief moment of privacy, Helen whispered to her son that he could call her for anything, at any time. Michael nodded vaguely but didn't seem capable of fully processing what that meant. When Christina returned with the water, Helen drank it slowly, observing the house with new eyes. Everything was impeccable, clean, organized, too perfect, like a staged set, not a lived-in home. As she left, Helen carried an unsettling certainty with her. Her son was in danger. She didn't know exactly what kind, but she had known Michael since the first second of his life. She knew his strength, his resilience, his ability to overcome challenges. The man she had just seen was not the son she had raised. He was a faded, hollowed-out version, as if something were slowly draining his essence. And the only constant in this whole situation was Christina, always present, always helpful, always controlling every detail of Michael's routine. Helen returned home with a heavy heart. She sat in the living room armchair, the same one where she used to rock Michael as a child, and allowed herself to feel fear. Fear that she was seeing things that weren't there, fear that she was being paranoid, but mostly fear that she was right. Because if she was right, if there really was something wrong happening inside that beautiful house in Tribeca, then she would have to act, and acting meant facing a truth that no mother wants to admit, that the person her son trusts most might be the very one who is destroying him. That night, Helen barely slept. She mentally replayed every interaction she had had with Christina over the years. She tried to find signs, patterns, moments when something seemed out of place, and the more she thought, the more small details began to fit together. The way Christina always seemed to be calculating, measuring reactions, controlling narratives. The way she subtly isolated Michael from old friends, always with plausible excuses. The insistence that he work less, rest more delegate responsibilities. In the morning, Helen made a decision. She couldn't confront Christina without proof. She couldn't accuse without evidence. Michael would never believe her, not in his current state. She needed to be strategic, patient, observant. She needed to act like Christina acted, silently, with precision, waiting for the right moment. The difference was that her intentions were the opposite. Where Christina was apparently destroying, Helen would protect. Where there was manipulation, there would be truth. Where there was danger, there would be salvation. But first, she needed to confirm her suspicions, and that meant observing, documenting, gathering information. It meant being more present, more attentive, more astute than ever before. Because if she was wrong, that was fine. She would apologize, laugh at her own overactive imagination, and move on. But if she was right, every second counted, and Helen was not willing to waste a single second more than necessary. Michael was all she had, her only son, the reason she woke up every morning, the meaning of her existence. And if someone was trying to take that from her, trying to destroy the good, hard-working man she had raised with so much sacrifice, then that person would have to face her first. And Helen, despite her age, despite the fragile appearance of a 65-year-old woman, was stronger than anyone could imagine, because a mother protecting her child knows no limits. And Helen was just getting started. In the days that followed, Helen transformed into a silent, methodical observer. She began writing everything down in a small notebook she kept in her purse, the times she called Michael and his state during each conversation, the days she visited the house and what she noticed in Christina's behavior, small details that, in isolation, seemed insignificant, but together began to form a disturbing pattern. Michael continued to deteriorate. In less than 3 weeks, he had lost a noticeable amount of weight. The clothes that once fit him perfectly now hung loosely on his frame. His face was more angular, his eyes sunken. When Helen commented on this during a call, Christina was quick to respond, even before Michael could open his mouth. She said he was having trouble eating, that the doctor had recommended supplements, that she was doing everything in her power to ensure he was properly nourished. The speed and precision of the answer caught Helen's attention. It was as if Christina was always prepared to justify, always one step ahead of any question. One Thursday afternoon, Helen decided to drop by the house unannounced again. This time she arrived earlier, around 3 o'clock. She rang the doorbell and waited. It took longer than usual for someone to answer. When the door finally opened, Christina was there, with a slightly disheveled expression. Her hair wasn't as impeccable as usual, and there was a faint flush on her cheeks. She seemed genuinely surprised, almost annoyed by her mother-in-law's presence. Helen walked in without waiting for an invitation, greeting her naturally. She asked about Michael. Christina said he was in the Home Office working on some documents. This surprised Helen, as Michael had mentioned that morning that he could barely concentrate enough to read a simple contract. She asked to see him. Christina tried to dissuade her, claiming he was busy, that he didn't like to be interrupted when he was working. But Helen insisted, with that polite yet firm tone that left no room for argument. In the office, Michael was sitting in front of the computer, but the screen was on standby. He was staring into space, his face expressionless. Hearing his mother's voice, he turned slowly, as if the movement required great effort. The smile he managed was weak, tired. Helen sat beside him, holding his hand again. It was even colder than last time. She asked about his work, about his projects. Michael answered vaguely, losing his train of thought mid-sentence, confusing dates and names. It was painful to watch. Christina remained at the door, observing. Helen, without looking directly at her, commented that Michael was getting weaker, that maybe they needed a second medical opinion, a different specialist. Christina was quick to say she had already thought of that she even had an appointment scheduled for the following week with a renowned neurologist. Once again, the readiness of her response bothered Helen. It was always like this. Christina had an answer for everything, a justification for every situation, always positioning herself as the devoted wife who did everything right. Before leaving, Helen asked to use the restroom. Christina pointed to the one in the hallway, but Helen deliberately went into the master bathroom. She wanted to see their most private space, to look for something, anything that would confirm or refute her suspicions. The bathroom was impeccable like the rest of the house, but when she opened the medicine cabinet, she found an astonishing number of bottles, medications for anxiety, for sleep, vitamin supplements, herbal remedies, many of them prescribed in Michael's name. She discreetly photographed the labels with her phone. Later, she would research each one. As she left the bathroom, she almost bumped into Christina, who was standing in the hallway, as if waiting. The look they exchanged lasted only a few seconds, but was charged with a silent tension. Helen thanked her for the visit and said goodbye, making it clear she would be back soon. Christina smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. In the car on her way home, Helen felt her heart racing. It wasn't fear, it was adrenaline. She was on the right track. She knew it now with more certainty. Arriving home, she sat down at her computer and began researching the medications she had photographed. Some were common, but others, when combined or used in incorrect dosages, could cause the exact symptoms Michael was exhibiting. Mental confusion, extreme fatigue, loss of appetite, apathy. She wasn't a doctor, but she was smart enough to understand that this cocktail of substances didn't seem appropriate. That night, Helen made a difficult decision. She needed to test her theory more concretely. The next time she had dinner with Michael and Christina, she would do something risky but necessary. She would switch the plates. She had already noticed that Christina always served Michael's food personally, always insisted he eat everything. If there was something wrong with the food, if something was being added, she had to find out. The opportunity arose the following Sunday. Christina had invited Helen for a special lunch. She said it would be good for Michael to have his mother's company, that it might cheer him up. Helen accepted, knowing this would be her chance. She arrived promptly at noon. Michael was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, his vacant gaze fixed on a television that wasn't even on. Helen's heart ached seeing him like this. Her son, once so vibrant and full of energy, now seemed like an empty shell. Lunch was served in the dining room, on the mahogany table Christina was so proud of. The food looked delicious. Christina had prepared a seafood risotto, a green salad, and a red berry dessert. She served the plates carefully, putting generous portions on Michael's. Helen watched intently. His plate really did seem to have a slightly different color. The sauce was thicker, darker. It could have just been a matter of portioning, of the sauce's concentration, but her gut told her otherwise. The moment Christina got up to get the wine from the kitchen, Helen acted quickly. She discreetly swapped her plate with Michael's. When Christina returned, Helen already had her fork in hand, ready to eat. She watched her daughter-in-law's reaction carefully. For a split second, Christina seemed to freeze. Her eyes fixed on the plates, a look of alarm crossing her face. But it was fast, so fast that someone less observant wouldn't have noticed. She immediately composed herself, smiled, and served the wine. Helen began to eat. The taste was good, but there was something strange at the end of each bite, a slightly bitter aftertaste, almost imperceptible. She kept eating, watching Christina out of the corner of her eye. Her daughter-in-law was tense, picking at her own food without really eating, her eyes constantly darting back to the plate now in front of Helen. Michael, oblivious to everything, ate mechanically, showing no pleasure or interest in the food. About 20 minutes after finishing her meal, Helen began to feel a subtle malaise. It was nothing severe, but there was a slight dizziness, a feeling of numbness in her fingertips, a mild nausea. She hid it, continued talking normally, but internally she was alarmed. This confirmed everything. There was something in that food, something that was being administered to Michael repeatedly, day after day, gradually destroying his health and his mind. She stayed at the house for another hour, observing, talking, behaving normally. But inside, she was planning her next steps. She couldn't confront Christina yet. She had no concrete proof, only suspicions and feelings. She needed to be smarter, more careful. She needed to protect Michael without putting him at even greater risk. As she said goodbye, she hugged her son tightly, whispering in his ear that soon everything would be okay, that she would take care of everything. Michael just nodded, not really understanding what that meant. On the way home, Helen felt the effects of that meal intensify slightly. The dizziness increased, as did the nausea. She had to pull the car over for a few minutes, take a deep breath and wait for it to pass. She imagined Michael feeling this every day, multiple times a day, without understanding what was happening to his own body. The anger she felt was visceral. How could someone do this to another person? And why? What was Christina's ultimate goal? When she got home, Helen went straight to the computer. She started researching gradual poisoning, substances that caused symptoms similar to Michael's. She discovered there were several possibilities, from improperly used medications to natural substances that, in small repeated doses, caused progressive health deterioration. The goal was usually to make it look like a natural illness, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. And it was working. Everyone thought Michael was just stressed, burned out from work. Not even the doctors had detected anything wrong because they weren't looking for it. Helen knew she needed help, but she couldn't involve the police yet, not without concrete proof. She decided she would hire a private investigator, someone discreet and competent. But before that, she needed to ensure Michael was safe, at least temporarily. She needed to get him out of that house, out of that environment controlled by Christina. But how could she do that without raising suspicion? How could she convince a confused and weakened man to leave the wife who, in his eyes, was the one taking the best care of his health? The answer came a few days later, during a phone call with Michael. He mentioned that an important client had suggested a meeting in the Berkshires to discuss a new development in a quieter setting. Michael said he would probably decline, that he didn't feel well enough to travel. Helen saw an opportunity. She encouraged him to accept, arguing that a few days away from his routine, breathing the fresh mountain air could do him good. She said she could even go with him if he wanted. Michael hesitated, but eventually agreed to think about it. Christina, of course, was against the idea. When Michael mentioned the possibility during dinner, she immediately raised objections. She said he was too weak to travel, that the cold mountain climate could worsen his condition, that it was better to stay home and rest properly. But Helen, in a later call, insisted. She said it would only be for a few days, that the change of scenery might be exactly what he needed, that she would go along to make sure he was okay. Finally, pressured by his mother, and also by a part of him that perhaps wanted a break, Michael agreed. Christina couldn't hide her displeasure. She tried to suggest that she go too, that she needed to be there to take care of her husband. But Helen, with a polite firmness, said it would be a trip just for the two of them, mother and son, that Christina deserved a rest too, that she was sacrificing too much. Her daughter-in-law had no choice but to accept, but the look she gave Helen was filled with something that went beyond simple annoyance. The trip was scheduled for the following week, 5 days in the Berkshires, staying at a comfortable hotel in the center of town. Helen knew those 5 days would be crucial. Away from Christina, away from that house, away from the food prepared with ulterior motives, Michael would have a chance to recover, at least partially, and she would have a chance to talk to him, to open his eyes, to make him see what was happening. It would be difficult. Michael loved Christina, trusted her. Accepting that his own wife was trying to destroy him would be devastating, but it was necessary. It was the only way to save him. As she packed her suitcase for the trip, Helen reflected on everything she had discovered in recent weeks. The signs had all been there from the beginning. She just hadn't wanted to see them, or maybe she didn't know what to look for, but now she knew. And now she would act. Because Michael was her son, her only son, and she had promised herself on the day he was born that she would always protect him, no matter from whom, no matter at what cost. That promise still stood, and Helen never broke her promises. The morning they left for the Berkshires was chilly and overcast, typical of a New York October that couldn't decide if it was still fall or already winter. Helen arrived early at the Tribeca townhouse to pick up Michael. Christina was at the door with an expression that tried to seem serene, but betrayed a poorly concealed annoyance. She had prepared a cooler bag with food for the trip, insisting that Michael needed to maintain his regulated diet even away from home. Helen thanked her politely, took the bag, but already knew its contents would never be consumed. She wouldn't take any more risks. Michael came down the stairs slowly, holding onto the railing like a man much older than his 41 years. He wore a wool sweater and jeans, but the clothes seemed too big on his thinned frame. Helen's heart ached. In just 3 months, her son had become a shadow of his former self. But she tried not to show her shock, maintaining an encouraging smile as she helped him into the car. Christina kissed Michael on the forehead, a gesture that seemed calculated, performative. She looked at Helen and said in a sweet but firm voice that she hoped her mother-in-law would take very good care of her husband, that he was fragile, that any carelessness could worsen his condition. Helen held her gaze and replied with the same venomous sweetness that she could rest assured that a mother is a mother, and that no one knew Michael better than she did. The subtext of the exchange was clear to both of them. It was a silent declaration of war. The drive to the Berkshires took about 2.5 hours. Michael slept for most of the journey, his head resting against the window, his breathing soft and regular. Helen drove in silence, her eyes alternating between the road and her son. Every mile that distanced them from New York City felt like a small relief, as if they were leaving not just a city, but an imminent danger zone. The Berkshires welcomed them with their characteristic New England charm. The colonial-style buildings, the towering pine trees, the crisp air that bit at their faces. Helen had chosen a boutique hotel in the center of town, away from the most intense tourist traffic. A discreet, comfortable place perfect for what she needed to do. Michael's room was spacious, with a wood-burning fireplace and a window overlooking the pine forests. She helped him get settled, watching how he moved with difficulty, how every action seemed to require a monumental effort. After Michael lay down to rest, Helen went down to the front desk and made a specific request. She wanted all of her son's meals to be prepared in the hotel kitchen, no exceptions, nothing from the cooler bag Christina had. Scent would be used. She also requested that the dishes be simple, light, and nutritious. The hotel manager, a cordial middle-aged man, sensed the seriousness in her tone and assured her that everything would be done exactly as requested. At their first dinner in the Berkshires, Helen personally served Michael's plate, a vegetable soup, whole wheat bread, fresh orange juice. He looked at the food with an expression of someone who wasn't sure if he could eat. But she encouraged him gently, saying it was important to eat, that this food was different, lighter, that it would do him good. Michael started slowly, the first spoonful, then the second. Gradually, he began to eat, and Helen noticed something she hadn't seen in months. He was actually eating, not just going through the mechanical motions. There was a spark of interest, however small. That first night, Michael slept deeply. Helen checked on his room a few times, just to make sure he was okay. He was breathing peacefully, his face relaxed, without the constant tension that had become his default expression lately. She returned to her own room with a sense of cautious hope, maybe away from Christina, away from that house he would have a chance to start recovering. The following days brought subtle but noticeable changes. On the second day, Michael woke up a little earlier, agreed to have breakfast without resistance. He ate toast with jam, fruit, and drank coffee with milk. On the third day, he himself suggested they take a walk through the town center. They went slowly, stopping several times, but he managed to walk for nearly half an hour. Helen walked beside him, observing every small sign of improvement. The color was returning to his face. His eyes, once so dull, were beginning to regain a slight sparkle. On the fourth day, something significant happened. They were having lunch at the hotel restaurant when Michael suddenly stopped eating and looked at his mother with an expression of genuine confusion. He said he felt strange, but in a different way. He felt lighter, more present, as if he were waking up from a very long sleep. He said his mind seemed less foggy, that he could think more clearly. Helen held his hand across the table and asked carefully if he remembered how he had been feeling for the past few months. Michael hesitated, as if accessing those memories required effort. Then he said he remembered a constant feeling of exhaustion, of confusion, of always being adrift, without control over his own body or mind. It was at that moment that Helen decided to start planting the first seeds of the truth. She told her son that she had noticed his deterioration, that she had been deeply worried, and that's why she had insisted on this trip. Michael looked at her with gratitude, and also with something that seemed like a vague fear. He asked if she thought there was something seriously wrong with him. Helen weighed her words. She couldn't reveal everything yet. He was still fragile, confused, not ready to absorb such a brutal truth. So she just said that she thought he had been burning out for a long time, that his body was asking for a break, that this trip was essential for his recovery. Michael seemed to accept the explanation, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. While Michael gradually recovered, Helen continued her investigation from a distance. Before they left, she had hired a private investigator in New York, a discreet and competent professional recommended by a trusted lawyer. The investigator, named Robert Miller, had over 20 years of experience in delicate cases. Helen had been clear about what she needed. She wanted him to watch Christina, document her activities, follow her movements, and find out if there was anything suspicious about her behavior or her relationships. Robert began his work the same day Helen and Michael left for the Berkshires. The first pieces of information he brought back were revealing. Christina had left the house a few hours after their departure. She didn't go just anywhere. She went to a law firm in Midtown, specializing in family and inheritance law. She stayed there for over 2 hours. Afterward, she went to a nearby cafe where she met a man Robert couldn't immediately identify but managed to photograph. The two talked for almost an hour. The conversation seemed intense, and at one point Christina passed an envelope to the man. The information reached Helen via an encrypted message. She read it all while sitting on the hotel balcony as Michael rested in his room. She felt a mix of anger and confirmation. Her suspicions weren't paranoia. Christina was planning something, and that something involved lawyers and secret meetings. Helen replied to Robert, asking him to identify the man from the cafe and to investigate the law firm. She wanted to know what kind of consultation Christina had, on what subject, and what documents she had brought. On the 5th day in the Berkshires, Michael was visibly better. He managed a longer walk along the trail leading to the town park. He talked about his business with more lucidity than he had shown in months. He mentioned projects that were underway, ideas he'd had, legitimate concerns about the company's future. Helen listened attentively, asking pointed questions, trying to gauge how much of his cognitive ability was returning. And it was returning slowly but consistently. It was during this walk that Michael brought up for the first time an insecurity about Christina. He said, almost in passing, that he had noticed his wife had been strange lately, more emotionally distant, yet paradoxically more controlling in her practical care. He said she always seemed attentive to what he ate, what he drank, the times he took his medication. At first, Michael had interpreted this as concern, as love, but now, with a clearer mind, he was beginning to find it excessive, almost suffocating. Helen listened without interrupting. Then, carefully, she asked if Michael felt better since he had been away from home, away from the routine controlled by Christina. He stopped walking, stood in silence for a long moment. Then he admitted that yes, for the first time in months he didn't feel like he was sinking. Helen seized the opening. She asked her son if he trusted her, if he believed she would always have his best interests at heart. Michael looked at his mother with a vulnerable expression and said yes, he had always trusted her, that she was the only person in the world he knew would never betray him. Helen felt her eyes well up, but maintained her composure. She told Michael she needed him to keep trusting her, even when things didn't make immediate sense. She said she had discovered disturbing things but was still gathering information, and that when the time was right, she would tell him everything. Michael was scared, wanted to know more, but she asked for his patience. She said it was to protect him, that revealing everything too soon could put him at risk. He was reluctant, but eventually agreed. The trust he had in his mother was greater than his curiosity or fear. That night, Helen received new information from Robert. The man from the cafe had been identified. He was an insurance broker, specializing in high-value policies. Robert had managed, through contacts, to discover that Christina had made an inquiry about a life insurance policy in Michael's name. A recent policy, taken out about 6 months ago for $10 million. The sole beneficiary was Christina. Michael had never mentioned anything about this to his mother, which suggested he might not even know the details. Or perhaps he had signed documents without paying close attention at a time when he was already confused and weakened. The information hit Helen like a punch to the gut. This was the clearest confirmation yet. Christina wasn't just trying to incapacitate Michael. She was planning his complete elimination, and she had done it methodically, ensuring that when he was gone, she would be the sole beneficiary of the entire fortune he had accumulated over decades of work. The plan was perverse in its simplicity. Gradually deteriorate Michael's health, make it look like a natural illness, perhaps a heart or neurological failure, something that wouldn't raise suspicion, and then reap the financial rewards. Helen spent that night awake, sitting on the balcony of her room, looking at the dark mountains under the starry sky. The anger she felt was visceral, but she knew she couldn't let it take over. She had to remain strategic, rational, careful. Every step had to be calculated, because one wrong move could put Michael in even greater danger. Christina was smart, manipulative, and clearly willing to see her plan through to the end. It wouldn't be easy to stop her, but Helen was determined to do just that. The next morning, Helen had a long phone call with Robert. She instructed him to continue following Christina, to document everything she did, everyone she met. She also asked him to investigate Christina's finances. She wanted to know if she had debts, if there were suspicious transactions, if she was receiving money from any undeclared source. Robert assured her he would do all of this and said he would have a more complete report in a few days. Michael, that morning, woke up with more energy than he had shown in a long time. He suggested they go up to Mount Greylock to see the sunrise the next day. Helen was surprised by the initiative, but agreed immediately. It was a clear sign that he was recovering, that his mind and body were responding positively to the absence of whatever was poisoning him. They spent the day exploring the town, visiting craft shops, drinking hot chocolate in a charming cafe. Michael even smiled a few times, a genuine smile that Helen hadn't seen in so long. She had almost forgotten what it looked like. During dinner, Michael brought up a delicate subject. He said Christina had called, earlier asking how he was, saying she missed him, that the house was empty without him. Michael mentioned that he felt strange during the call. He said her voice sounded genuine, but there was something artificial about it, as if she were playing a role. Helen asked what he had said. Michael said he had been cordial, that he said he was fine, that the trip was doing him good, but that he missed her too. Helen sensed he wasn't being completely honest. She asked directly if he really missed Christina. Michael hesitated. Then he admitted he didn't know. He said he was confused about his own feelings, that the last few months had been so foggy that he could no longer distinguish what was real from what was just part of the haze he had been living in. Helen decided it was time to push a little further. She asked Michael if he remembered when he had started feeling sick. He thought for a long time. He said he wasn't sure, that it seemed to have been gradual, but if he forced himself to remember, it might have started around 6 months ago. Helen made a mental note. 6 months, exactly when the insurance policy had been taken out. It wasn't a coincidence. She asked if Michael remembered signing any documents related to life insurance recently. He frowned, trying to access fragmented memories. He said maybe that Christina had brought some papers for him to sign, saying it was just updating policies, routine stuff. He had trusted her and signed without reading carefully. After all, why would he distrust his own wife? Helen felt the anger rise again, but kept her voice calm. She told Michael that when they returned to New York, it would be important to review all their financial documents, all the policies, all the contracts. He agreed, but didn't seem to understand the urgency she was trying to convey. On the 6th day, their last before returning to New York, they went up to Mount Greylock before dawn. The cold was intense, biting, but the view was breathtaking. From the top they could see the Appalachian mountain range stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky began to lighten slowly, changing from black to dark blue, then to shades of orange and pink. Michael stood in silence, absorbing the beauty of the moment. Helen watched her son, seeing in him a shadow of the man he used to be, but also seeing hope. He was coming back. Slowly, but he was. When the sun finally appeared on the horizon, bathing everything in golden light, Michael turned to his mother and said something she would never forget. He said he felt like he was being reborn, as if the last few months had been a nightmare from which he was finally waking up. He said he didn't fully understand what had happened, but he knew something was wrong and he trusted his mother to help him find out what. Helen hugged her son, feeling tears stream down her face. She promised him they would find out together, that she would protect him, that they would make everything right this time. But inside, Helen knew the hardest part was yet to come. Returning to New York meant returning to Christina's territory. It meant exposing Michael to danger again. She had to act fast. She needed to gather all the proof, all the documents, all the evidence. She needed to build a case so solid that Christina would have no way to escape, and she had to do it all without the other woman realizing what was happening. Because if Christina suspected she was being investigated, she might accelerate her plans or destroy evidence. The drive back to New York was quiet. Michael seemed contemplative, looking out the window, processing everything that had happened in the last few days. Helen drove with her hands firm on the wheel, her mind already plotting the next steps. When they arrived at the townhouse in Tribeca, Christina was waiting at the door. She hugged Michael with an exaggerated display of affection, saying how much she had missed him, how empty the house had been, but Helen noticed the look Christina gave Michael. It was an assessing, calculating look, checking his condition, noticing that he was different, better, more present, and that clearly bothered her. After helping Michael inside, Christina turned to Helen with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thanked her for the trip, said it seemed to have done her husband good. Helen replied with icy politeness, saying yes, the fresh air and rest had been excellent. The two women stared at each other for a brief moment, and in that silence there was a mutual understanding. They both knew the game had changed. Christina realized she was losing control. Helen knew she had bought some time, but the real battle was yet to come, and Helen was more than ready to fight it. In the days following their return from the Berkshires, a tense dynamic settled over the Tribeca townhouse. Michael, still recovering, tried to resume his work routine but more cautiously. He spent a few hours at the office but came home in the mid-afternoon, something that would have been unthinkable before the trip. Christina tried to regain control over his meals, insisting on preparing special dishes, but Michael, with a clarity he hadn't shown in months, began to refuse certain things. He said he preferred to eat more simply, that his stomach wasn't handling elaborate foods well. Christina would insist, argue, but she couldn't force him without seeming suspicious. Helen increased the frequency of her visits. She showed up almost every day, always with a plausible excuse. She brought food she had prepared, suggested they have lunch out, and created situations that prevented Christina from having total control over Michael's diet. Her daughter-in-law couldn't complain openly without seeming strange or overly controlling, but the tension between the two women was palpable. Every interaction was loaded with subtext, every word carefully chosen. During one of these visits, Helen managed to get a few minutes alone with Michael while Christina was on a call upstairs. She was quick and direct. She told her son he needed to start being more careful, more attentive. She asked him to avoid eating or drinking anything Christina prepared unless other people were present. Michael was alarmed and wanted to know why. Helen said she couldn't explain everything yet, but that he had to trust her, that it was a matter of life and death. The seriousness in her voice, the poorly disguised fear in her eyes were enough for Michael to agree without further questions. He promised he would be careful. Meanwhile, Robert Miller continued his investigation. The information he brought back each day painted an increasingly dark picture of Christina. He had discovered she had significant debts that Michael knew nothing about. Credit card debts accumulated over the past 2 years, totaling nearly $200,000. She had hidden it well, using cards in her maiden name and having mail sent to another address. Robert also found that Christina had consulted several law firms specializing in divorce and asset division, always asking about hypothetical scenarios involving widowhood and inheritance. But the most disturbing discovery came when Robert gained access to Christina's purchase records from a compounding pharmacy through a contact. Over the past 6 months, she had bought several substances that individually seemed harmless. Herbal remedies, supplements, natural compounds. But Robert, who had worked on similar cases before, recognized the pattern. When combined in certain proportions, those substances could cause the exact symptoms Michael had exhibited: mental confusion, extreme fatigue, loss of appetite, gradual health deterioration. And the most perverse part was that it all seemed natural, as if it were just stress or an undiagnosed illness. Upon receiving this information, Helen felt a mix of horror and validation. Her suspicions were correct. Christina was really poisoning Michael, slowly, methodically, using substances that wouldn't leave obvious traces in conventional tests. It was a diabolical plan in its sophistication, and it would have worked perfectly if not for the attention of a mother who knew her son too well not to notice something was wrong. With the evidence mounting, Helen began to prepare her next move. She consulted with lawyers specializing in complex crimes. She spoke with toxicologists about Michael's symptoms and the substances Christina had acquired. Every professional confirmed what she already knew. There was a solid case, but it would need even more concrete proof to ensure Christina didn't escape through some legal loophole. It was then that Helen made a risky but necessary decision. She needed a confession, or at least direct evidence of Christina's behavior. She asked Robert to install discrete recording devices in strategic areas of the townhouse. She knew this was in a legal grey area, but she also knew her son's life was at stake. Morality at that moment was secondary to survival. Robert managed to get into the house when both Michael and Christina were out. He installed small audio recorders in 3 places: the kitchen, the master bedroom, and the office. They were modern devices, almost impossible to detect, with the capacity for several days of continuous recording. Helen knew she was crossing a line, but she didn't hesitate. If Christina was capable of slowly poisoning her own husband, then she didn't deserve the benefit of privacy or legal scruples. The first recordings were revealing, but not in the way Helen had expected. Christina was too careful to say anything incriminating at home. Her conversations with Michael were always superficial, always performative. She would ask about his day, how he was feeling, maintaining the facade of a concerned wife. But in one of the recordings from the office, where Christina sometimes stayed alone using the computer, there was something interesting. She was talking on the phone with someone, keeping her voice low, but the recorder picked up everything. Christina was talking to a friend, someone who clearly knew at least part of the plan. She complained that Michael was taking longer than expected to deteriorate completely. She said the trip to the Berkshires had messed everything up, that he had come back different, more alert. The friend, on the other end of the line, suggested that maybe it was time to speed up the process. Christina hesitated, then said she had to be careful, that her mother-in-law was suspicious, that she couldn't risk raising more suspicion. The conversation continued with discussions about money, about how Christina planned to use the insurance to pay off her debts and still have enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Helen listened to the recording with trembling hands. There it was, the definitive confirmation, not just of Christina's intentions, but of her complete lack of remorse. She spoke about the end of Michael's life as if discussing a financial investment, calculating returns, assessing risks. It was monstrous. And Helen knew that this recording, despite being obtained questionably, was the missing piece. With all the evidence gathered, documents, photographs, recordings, financial reports, Helen scheduled a meeting with a renowned criminal defense attorney in New York. Henry Marshall had over 30 years of experience in complex cases and an impeccable reputation. He listened to everything Helen had to present, examined every document, every recording. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and said the case was solid, but there was a problem. The recordings, though incriminating, could be legally challenged for being obtained without a court order. Helen asked what he suggested. Henry thought for a long moment, then said the ideal scenario would be to get a direct confession in a controlled setting, preferably with witnesses present. He suggested they set up a situation where Christina was confronted with the evidence in a way she couldn't escape, forcing her to admit at least part of what she had done. With a witnessed in-person confession, combined with all the other evidence, the case would be irrefutable. Helen agreed, but she knew it would be dangerous. Confronting Christina directly could make her react unpredictably, potentially putting Michael at even greater risk. But there was no other option. Time was running out. Michael, though better than in previous months, was still not fully recovered, and Helen knew that Christina, realizing she was losing control, might try something desperate. The plan was carefully laid out. Helen would host a dinner at her apartment, inviting Michael and Christina. During the dinner, with Henry Marshall present as a witness under the guise of being an old family friend, the evidence would be presented. Christina would be confronted, and with all the proof on the table, she would have no choice but to admit her guilt or incriminate herself further with lies that could be easily disproven. The date was set. A Friday, 10 days after their return from the Berkshires. Helen spent those days in a state of constant anxiety. She checked on Michael several times a day, ensured he didn't consume anything prepared exclusively by Christina, and remained vigilant. Michael sensed the tension but didn't fully understand its source. Helen had only told him that everything would be clarified soon, that he needed to trust her a little longer. Christina, for her part, seemed increasingly nervous. Her attempts to regain control over Michael's routine were met with constant resistance. He was eating out more, accepting the meals Helen brought, and avoiding the elaborate dishes she prepared. Christina's frustration was visible, but she tried to hide it with forced smiles and comments about how good it was that Michael had more of an appetite, regardless of the source of the food. The night before the planned dinner, Helen received a call from Robert. He had one last piece of information, something he had discovered through contacts in the financial system. Christina had opened an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands about 8 months ago. The account was still empty, but its existence suggested long-term planning. She was preparing an escape route for the money, a way to ensure that even if something went wrong, she would have hidden resources inaccessible to American authorities. This information was added to the dossier that would be presented at dinner. Helen reviewed everything one last time. She had financial evidence, recordings, professional testimonies, records of suspicious purchases, bank movements. She had a clear pattern of behavior, a timeline that made sense, an obvious motive. Everything was ready. Now it was just a matter of executing the plan and hoping it worked. Michael, oblivious to all this, was excited about the dinner. He said it had been a long time since they had gathered with loved ones, that it would be nice to have a quiet evening with his mother, his wife, and an old friend. His innocence broke Helen's heart. He didn't yet know that this night would change his life forever, that the truth to be revealed would shatter the image he had of his marriage, his wife, and his own safety. But it was necessary. The truth, however painful, was the only way to free him, and Helen was ready to free him no matter the cost. Friday arrived, heavy with a tension that only Helen seemed to feel in its full intensity. She woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and spent the first hours of the day mentally reviewing every detail of what would happen that night. The apartment was ready. Henry Marshall would arrive at 7 o'clock, half an hour before Michael and Christina. He would pose as an old family friend, someone Helen hadn't seen in years who happened to be in New York. The excuse was flimsy, but it would have to do. The important thing was to have a qualified witness present for what was to come. Helen set the table carefully. She used the good china, the set she had received as a wedding gift, and rarely used. She placed fresh flowers in the center, adjusted the chairs, checked the lighting. Everything had to look normal, like a simple family gathering. But in a drawer of the sideboard lay all the documents, the evidence, carefully organized in folders, photographs, bank statements, Robert's reports, transcripts of the recordings, medical opinions, all ready to be presented at the right moment. At 7 sharp, Henry Marshall rang the doorbell. He was a man in his 60s with carefully combed grey hair and an impeccable dark suit. He had a presence that inspired respect and confidence. Helen welcomed him and led him to the living room where she explained once more how the evening would unfold. Henry listened attentively, asking pointed questions about a few details. He was methodical, precise, and Helen felt more secure with him there. At 7:30 the doorbell rang again. Michael and Christina had arrived. Helen took a deep breath, smoothed her dress and went to open the door. Michael greeted her with a tight hug. He looked much better than he had weeks ago. His face had more color, his eyes were more alive. Christina beside him was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She wore an elegant wine-colored suit, her hair in a low bun. She looked the perfect picture of a sophisticated, caring wife. Helen introduced Henry as an old friend from when she was married, someone who had worked with her late husband. The story was accepted without question. Michael greeted Henry cordially, interested in hearing stories about his father. Christina was polite, but Helen caught a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Christina was shrewd, always observant, and the presence of a stranger at this dinner clearly bothered her, even if she didn't know exactly why. The dinner began peacefully. Helen served an antipasto platter, followed by a mushroom risotto she had prepared herself. The conversation flowed around neutral topics. Henry told old stories. Michael participated with interest. Christina maintained a courteous smile but said little. Helen watched everything, waiting for the right moment. It couldn't be rushed. She needed to let the meal progress, to create an atmosphere that would make it harder for Christina to simply get up and leave when things got uncomfortable. It was during dessert, a crème brûlée that had been Michael's favorite since childhood, that Helen decided it was time. She served coffee to everyone, made sure they were comfortable, and then, with a calmness she didn't feel, said there was something important she needed to discuss. The tone of her voice changed. It became more serious, heavier. Michael looked at her with curiosity. Christina visibly tensed. Helen began by saying that in recent weeks she had noticed things that deeply concerned her. She spoke of Michael's deteriorating health, of how it had happened so quickly and inexplicably. She mentioned that doctors had found no apparent cause, but that she, as a mother, had felt something was profoundly wrong. Michael agreed, saying he himself had been confused about what was happening to his own body. Christina interrupted, saying, "They all knew this, that it was stress, overwork, and that Michael was already recovering." Helen looked directly at her and said, "No, it wasn't stress." The silence that followed was tense. Henry remained in his chair, observing, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, taking in every nuance of the conversation. Helen continued, "She said she had hired a private investigator because her suspicions haunted her, because she couldn't stand by while her son wasted away before her eyes." Christina turned pale. Michael looked at his mother with a mixture of confusion and alarm. He asked what she was, saying what she had discovered. Helen stood up and went to the sideboard. She opened the drawer and took out the first folder. She returned to the table and began to spread documents before them. Bank statements showing Christina's hidden debts, records of consultations with law firms specializing in inheritance, the $10 million life insurance policy taken out 6 months ago, with Christina as the sole beneficiary. Michael stared at the documents with growing disbelief. He picked up the policy with trembling hands. He said he didn't remember signing it, or rather, he vaguely remembered Christina bringing papers saying it was routine, just updating documents. But $10 million? He looked at his wife, his eyes full of questions. Christina tried to maintain her composure. She said the policy had been the accountant's idea, that it was to protect their assets, that there was nothing wrong with it. Helen let that explanation hang in the air for a moment, then presented the next piece of evidence. Christina's purchase records from compounding pharmacies, herbal substances, supplements, compounds that individually seemed harmless. But Helen had consulted toxicologists, specialized doctors, and they confirmed that those substances, when combined in the right proportions, could cause the exact symptoms Michael had exhibited: mental confusion, extreme fatigue, loss of appetite, progressive deterioration. Michael looked at the lists of substances, then at Christina. He asked, his voice breaking, what this was. Christina tried to explain, said they were just supplements she had bought to help him, that she wanted him to be healthier. But the explanation sounded weak, even to her own ears. Helen gave no quarter. She presented the next piece of evidence. Photographs of Christina meeting with the insurance broker, entering the law firm, talking in cafes with people Michael didn't know. And then, the most devastating piece, the transcript of the recording. Helen read it aloud, her voice steady despite her breaking heart. Christina's words on the phone with her friend, complaining that Michael was taking longer than expected to deteriorate completely. The talk of speeding up the process, the comments about the insurance money, about how she planned to use it to pay off debts and live comfortably. Every word was a stab. Michael was paralyzed, the color draining from his face. He looked at Christina as if seeing a stranger, someone he had never truly known. Christina tried to deny it. She said it was a lie, that the recording was fake, that Helen was making it all up for some sick reason. But her voice trembled. Her hands clutched the napkin on the table until her knuckles turned white. Michael stood up from his chair, staggering slightly. He asked in a voice he barely recognized if it was true, if she had really tried to poison him, if everything he had felt, the confusion, the weakness, the feeling of dying slowly, had been caused by the person who slept beside him every night. Christina kept denying it, but now tears streamed down her face, tears of anger, of frustration, of fear, not of remorse. Helen saw that clearly. There was no regret in those eyes, only the rage of being caught. Henry Marshall, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. He introduced himself as an attorney, said he was there as a witness to what was being revealed. He explained that the evidence presented was sufficient for criminal charges, that the situation was extremely serious. Christina finally seemed to grasp the gravity of what was happening. She looked at Henry, then at Helen, then at Michael, and then something in her broke. It wasn't a dramatic, remorseful confession. It was an explosion of anger and justification. She screamed that yes, she had done it all, that Michael was a fool who didn't value her, that she had spent 13 years being the perfect wife, smiling at people who didn't matter, organizing boring dinners, living a life that wasn't hers, that she deserved more, deserved the money Michael had accumulated, deserved to be free. She said it had all started as a fantasy, a thought she never believed she'd have the courage to act on. But then she met someone, another man, someone who made her feel alive again. He had suggested the plan, shown her how it could be done so no one would suspect. The substances were easy to get, the symptoms would seem natural, and in the end, she would have everything. The money, the freedom, a new life with someone who truly wanted her. She had thought it would be easy, that Michael wouldn't feel much pain, that it would be like gradually falling asleep. Michael was in shock. He held on to the edge of the table to keep from falling. Christina's words echoed in the room, each one more devastating than the last. 13 years of marriage, 13 years in which he had trusted completely, loved in the only way he knew how, worked to build a comfortable life for them both. And it had all been a lie, worse than a lie. It had been a death trap. Helen moved to her son's side, holding his arm to support him. She was shaken too, but she couldn't show weakness now. She had to be strong for him. She looked at Christina with an expression of absolute disgust. She said the police would be called, that everything revealed here would be presented to the authorities, that Christina would answer for attempted murder, for fraud, for everything she had done. Christina finally seemed to realize there was no way out. The anger gave way to desperation. She tried to plead, said it had been a mistake, that she never would have really gone through with it, that she loved Michael. But the words sounded hollow after the confession she had just made. Henry was already on the phone, speaking with contacts at the police department, explaining the situation. Within an hour, authorities would be there. Michael finally found his voice. He told Christina with a terrifying calm to get out of his mother's house immediately, that he never wanted to see her again, that she had destroyed everything, that she was dead to him. Christina tried to argue, but Helen was firm. She said she would leave now, or she would wait for the police there. Christina grabbed her purse with trembling hands and left, the sound of her heels echoing down the hall until the door closed. The silence that remained was devastating. Michael sat down again, burying his face in his hands. He began to cry, not with dramatic sobs, but with silent tears that streamed between his fingers. Helen sat beside him, holding him as she did when he was a child and got hurt. Henry gave them space, remaining in the room, but stepping away to allow for that moment of private grief. After a long time, Michael lifted his face. His eyes were red, swollen. He asked his mother how she had found out, how she had known. Helen told him everything. From the first suspicion at the Sunday lunch, to switching the plates, the malaise she felt, the decision to hire Robert. She told him about the trip to the Berkshires, how it had been deliberately planned to get him out of the house, to interrupt the poisoning, to give him a chance to recover. Michael listened in silence. When she finished, he said something Helen would never forget. He said she had saved his life, literally, that if it weren't for her attention, her courage, her determination, he would be dead now, or close to it, destroyed from the inside, just waiting for the end. He thanked her with a broken voice, squeezing his mother's hands between his own. Helen said he didn't need to thank her, that he was her son, that she would always protect him always, that a mother feels when something is wrong with her child, no matter the distance, no matter the circumstances, that she would never let anything bad happen to him, not as long as she had the strength to stop it. Henry came back over to them. He explained the next steps. The police would come, take statements, examine the evidence. Christina would be charged, likely held without bail, given the severity of the accusations. There would be a long process, testimonies, forensic analysis, but with the evidence Helen had gathered, the case was solid. Christina would have no way to escape. And beyond the criminal case, there were the civil matters. The assets needed to be protected, documents reviewed, powers of attorney revoked, beneficiaries changed. It would be a difficult but necessary period. Michael listened to the explanations, nodding mechanically. He was still processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. It wasn't just the betrayal, though that was devastating enough. It was the fact that the person he had shared his life with for 13 years had coldly planned his elimination, had looked at him every day, smiled, kissed him, lay beside him every night while slowly poisoning him. It was a monstrosity his mind struggled to accept as real. The police arrived around 10 o'clock. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, both experienced. Henry had already spoken with them, giving them a preliminary overview. They listened to Michael's and Helen's statements, examined the evidence, asked detailed questions. The seriousness with which they treated the case was reassuring. They said Christina would be located immediately for questioning, that forensic tests would be done, that the case was being treated with the highest priority. When they were finally alone, just mother and son, it was past midnight. Helen made chamomile tea, the same kind she used to make when Michael was a child and couldn't sleep. They sat on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket, and were silent for a long time. There were no adequate words for that moment, just each other's presence, the certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Michael finally broke the silence. He asked what he would do now, how he would rebuild his life after something like this. Helen said she didn't know that it would be hard, that it would take time, but that he was strong, stronger than he imagined, that he had survived something that would kill many, that he had a second chance, and that chance was precious. She said he wasn't alone, that she would be there every step of the way, and that with time he would learn to trust again, to live again, not in the same way, because no one comes out of an experience like this unscathed, but in a new way, maybe even a better way, because now he knew what he was capable of surviving. Michael rested his head on his mother's shoulder, just as he did when he was a child, and for the first time on that endless night, he felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't happiness, not by a long shot, but it was the certainty that he would stay alive, that he would see the sun rise the next day, that he would have the chance to rebuild, to start over. And that, at that moment, was enough. Helen looked out the window, seeing the lights of New York City spread out below. Each light represented a life, a story, battles being fought in silence. She had fought hers and won. She had saved her son from the worst imaginable fate. The road ahead would be long and painful, but they would walk it together. And in the end, they would emerge stronger, wiser, more aware of the fragility of life and the importance of protecting those who truly matter. The night wore on and eventually gave way to the early morning. Michael fell asleep on the sofa, physically and emotionally exhausted. Helen covered him with the blanket, gently stroked his hair, and allowed herself finally to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The tears came, silent but deep. They were not tears of defeat, but of relief. Relief for having acted in time, for having trusted her instincts, for having done what was necessary even when it seemed impossible. She sat in the armchair next to the sofa where Michael slept, and there she remained, vigilant as she had always been, protecting the one who was her greatest treasure, her son, her reason for living. The storm had passed, but Helen knew the scars would take time to heal, and she would be there at every moment, ensuring that he not only survived, but that he learned to live fully again. Because that's what mothers did. They protected, they saved, they remained. Always. When the sun began to rise, Michael woke up slowly. For a brief moment he seemed confused about where he was. Then the memory of the previous night came back like an avalanche, and Helen saw the pain cross his face again. He sat up, ran his hands through his hair, and looked around as if hoping it had all been a nightmare, but it wasn't. It was real, terribly real. Helen made coffee, Not the elaborate coffee with frothed milk and spices that Christina used to make, but the simple, strong coffee she had always prepared when Michael was young and stayed up late studying for important exams. He accepted the cup with a sad half-smile, grateful for the familiarity of the gesture. They sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, Michael ate toast with butter, fruit, and drank orange juice. He ate because he was actually hungry, not because someone was insisting or controlling him. During breakfast, Michael's phone rang several times. It was Christina. He looked at the device with an expression of disgust and let the calls go to voicemail. Helen suggested he block the number. Michael hesitated, then agreed. With a few taps on the screen, that connection was severed. It was a small gesture, but symbolically immense. It was the first step toward complete detachment. Around 9 in the morning, Henry called. He had news. Christina had been located during the night at a hotel on the Upper East Side. She was with a man, the same one Robert had photographed earlier in their secret meetings. The police had searched the room and found incriminating documents, including plane tickets to Buenos Aires for the following week. Christina was clearly planning to flee. She and her accomplice were taken in for questioning. He, when confronted with the evidence, confessed to helping with the plan, admitted it had been his idea from the start, and tried to place all the blame on Christina, saying she was obsessed with the idea of getting her husband's money. Michael listened in silence. When Henry hung up, he told his mother he didn't even know who that man was, had never heard Christina mention him. Helen explained that Robert had discovered he was someone Christina had met about a year ago at a social event. He worked as a financial consultant and had a history of debt and fraud charges. He was exactly the type of person who saw Michael not as a human being, but as a financial opportunity. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal procedures. Michael had to give a formal statement at the police station, undergo medical exams to document the effects of the substances he had involuntarily consumed, and review all financial documents with lawyers. Each step was painful. Each conversation forced him to relive the betrayal, the manipulation, the proximity to death he hadn't even fully realized while it was happening. Helen was there for all of it. She accompanied him to every doctor's appointment, every meeting with lawyers, every trip to the station. She held her son's hand when things got too difficult, offered silence when words were insufficient, and provided nutritious meals when he forgot to eat. She was a constant presence, an anchor in the midst of the chaos. The medical exams revealed what Helen already suspected. Michael had abnormal concentrations of several substances in his system. The doctors explained that if the poisoning had continued for a few more weeks, the damage could have been irreversible. Liver and kidney problems, possibly permanent neurological damage. The trip to the Berkshires, the interruption of the poisoning cycle, had literally saved not just his life, but his quality of life. Michael looked at those reports and felt a chill. He had been so close, so dangerously close. The news of the case eventually leaked to the media. Not all the details, but enough for it to become a sensationalist story. Successful businessman nearly murdered by his own wife. The newspapers speculated, invented details, and turned Michael's personal tragedy into public entertainment. He had to deal with journalists trying to interview him, photographers at his office door, and acquaintances, and even strangers opining about his life on social media. It was during this period that Michael truly understood the value of the discretion he had always maintained. Because he had lived without ostentation, without excessive exposure, most people didn't know exactly who he was. This allowed him to retreat, to avoid much of the media hysteria. But it was still difficult. Feeling exposed, judged, turned into a character in a story he never wanted to live. Helen protected him from this too. She talked to lawyers about legal measures against invasive publications, instructed Michael not to give statements, and created a barrier between him and the media circus. She understood that beyond the emotional pain of betrayal, there was the public humiliation of having been so completely deceived. Michael was a proud, intelligent man, used to being in control. Discovering that he had been so systematically manipulated attacked not only his trust in other people, but his trust in himself. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, Michael and Helen were at her apartment when he finally broke down. It wasn't any specific event that triggered it, just the accumulation of everything. He began to cry in a way she hadn't seen since he was a child. Deep sobs that shook his whole body, tears that seemed to come from a bottomless well. Helen just held him, letting him release all that pent-up pain. She didn't try to console him with empty words, didn't say everything would be okay, because at that moment it wouldn't be. She was simply present, offering the unconditional love of a mother. When he finally calmed down, Michael said something that surprised Helen. He said it wasn't just Christina's betrayal that hurt so much. It was the fact that he hadn't noticed. He was a shrewd businessman, capable of identifying fraud in complex contracts, of reading between the lines of deceptive proposals. But he hadn't been able to read the person he shared his bed with. He felt foolish, naive, blind. Helen held his face in her hands and said firmly that it wasn't his fault. That love involves trust, that marriage should be a safe space, and that Christina had abused that trust in a monstrous way. She said that the capacity to love and trust was not a weakness, it was humanity. And that Christina, not him, was the one who should be ashamed. His mother's words didn't heal the wound instantly, but they planted a seed. Michael began to understand that he had been a victim, not an accomplice, that his kindness and trust were not flaws to be corrected, but qualities that had been exploited by someone without scruples. It was a slow process of rebuilding his self-esteem, but it was beginning. Meanwhile, the legal case against Christina moved forward. With the evidence presented, the prosecution had filed charges for attempted first-degree murder and fraud. Her accomplice was also being prosecuted as a co-conspirator. Christina tried to negotiate some kind of plea deal through her lawyers. She offered to return all access to accounts, to renounce any claim on the assets in exchange for a reduced sentence. But Henry was categorical in his advice to Michael. He said it was a personal decision, but from a legal and moral standpoint, allowing Christina to get off with a light sentence would send a dangerous message. Michael agreed. He didn't want revenge, but he wanted justice. He wanted there to be real consequences for what she had tried to do. The trial was set for 6 months later. It would be a long process, with expert testimony, witnesses, and legal arguments. Michael would have to testify to relive everything publicly in a courtroom. The prospect was terrifying, but also necessary. It was part of the process of closure, of turning that traumatic experience into something with a defined end. During this waiting period, Michael began to reorganize his life. He temporarily moved out of the Tribeca townhouse. He could no longer be in that space without feeling Christina's toxic presence in every room. He stayed at Helen's apartment for a few weeks, then rented a smaller, more functional apartment in Soho. It was a fresh start, a blank page. He also started therapy, something he had never considered before but which Helen gently suggested and he accepted. He found a psychologist specializing in trauma who helped him process not only the betrayal, but the entire experience of being poisoned, of feeling his mind and body fail without understanding why. The sessions were difficult. He often left them emotionally exhausted, but they were necessary. They were part of the healing. There were moments of intense anger, moments when Michael imagined confronting Christina again, saying everything he felt, demanding explanations that made sense. But Henry advised him against any direct contact, and Helen reinforced this, saying that Christina no longer deserved a moment of his attention, not a single word, no space in his thoughts beyond what was absolutely necessary for the legal process. Slowly, Michael began to rebuild his social network. He had drifted away from many friends during the months he was sick, partly because he had no energy to socialize, and partly because Christina had subtly isolated him. Now he reconnected. He explained, without going into too much detail, that he had been through a difficult period with his health and personal life. His true friends, the ones who mattered, were there, offering support without judgment. He also gradually returned to work. At first, just a few hours a day, reviewing projects, attending important meetings. His team, who had been worried during his months-long absence, was relieved to see him return. Michael explained to his closest partners and managers, in a summarized way, what had happened. They were shocked but offered their full support. They assured him the company would continue to run smoothly while he recovered completely. Curiously, work helped in his recovery. Having projects to focus on, concrete problems to solve, provided a structure, a purpose beyond the pain and the healing process. Michael realized his identity couldn't be solely tied to the trauma he had suffered. He was more than that. He was a competent businessman, a respected leader, someone who had built something valuable through his own effort. Christina had tried to take his life, but she hadn't managed to destroy who he essentially was. One Sunday, 3 months after the confrontation, Michael and Helen went together to the cemetery where his father was buried. It had been years since Michael had visited the grave. Life always seemed too busy. The excuses always came easily. But on that day, he felt the need to be there, to connect with the memory of the man he hadn't had the chance to know well, who had left too soon. They sat on a bench near the plot. Helen talked about her husband, about how proud he would have been of the man Michael had become, about how furious he would have been at what Christina had tried to do. She said her husband's greatest sadness had always been the idea of not being there to protect his family. But she was sure that somehow he was watching over them, that he had guided her instincts during those months of suspicion and investigation. Michael listened, feeling a connection to his absent father that he had never felt before. He promised silently that he would live in a way that honored him, that he wouldn't let the evil of some people destroy his capacity to be good, to trust, to love, that he would use this experience to become stronger, wiser, more compassionate toward others who went through similar traumas. When they left the cemetery, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of ignorance, not the peace of pretending everything was fine, but the peace of someone who had faced the worst and survived, the peace of someone who knew he had a mother by his side who had literally saved his life, the peace of someone who, despite everything, still had a future ahead of him. And as they drove back through the heavy New York traffic, mother and son side by side, Helen felt that her mission was accomplished. Not completely, because the healing process would continue for a long time, but the most important part was done. Michael was alive, he was recovering, he was learning to live again, and she would be there, every step of the way, just as she had always been. Because that's what mothers did. They protected, they saved, they remained. Always, unconditionally, eternally. 6 months passed like a succession of days that sometimes felt eternal and at other times simply dissolved into a fog. Michael had learned that recovery from trauma doesn't follow a straight line. There were days when he woke up feeling strong, capable of facing the world, optimistic about the future. And there were days when the weight of what had happened crushed him, making him question every decision he had made in the last 13 years, every sign he had ignored, every moment he had trusted blindly. Helen remained his constant throughout this period. She had learned to recognize the bad days just from the tone of his voice on the phone in the morning. On those days she would show up uninvited, bring homemade food and sit in silence in his living room until Michael was ready to talk. She never judged, never rushed, never minimized his pain. She was simply present, an anchor in the midst of the emotional storm. Christina's trial was scheduled for the first week of April. As the date approached, Michael's anxiety grew. He would have to see her again, face that look he no longer recognized as belonging to the person he had loved. He would have to recount in detail before judges, lawyers, a jury, and spectators how he had been systematically poisoned by his own wife. The prospect was terrifying. Henry Marshall prepared Michael meticulously for his testimony. They ran simulations, reviewed every possible question, every tactic Christina's defense might use to discredit or confuse him. Henry explained that the defense would try to paint him as an absent husband, a man who emotionally neglected his wife, attempting to create a narrative where Christina was presented as the victim of an unhappy marriage that drove her to desperation. It was absurd considering she had tried to kill him, but it was a common strategy in such cases. The night before the trial, Michael couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony of his Soho apartment, watching the illuminated city, thinking about how drastically his life had changed in less than a year. 12 months ago, he was in his office, focused on business, believing he had a stable and predictable life. Now he was about to testify against the woman who had promised to love him until death did them part. The morbid irony was not lost on him. The first day of the trial was surreal. The courtroom was packed. The press had turned the case into a national headline. Successful businessman nearly murdered by greedy wife. The simplistic narrative the newspapers loved, ignoring all the nuances and complexities of the real situation. Michael entered the courtroom accompanied by Helen and Henry. He felt all eyes on him, heard the whispers, saw the cameras trying to capture his image. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him shaken. Christina was sitting at the defense table between her two lawyers. She wore a discreet grey suit, her hair in a simple bun with little makeup, clearly instructed by her defense to appear remorseful and vulnerable. When Michael entered, she looked at him. It was only for a second, but in that look, there was something Michael couldn't quite decipher. Fear, regret, anger at being caught. Perhaps a combination of all three. The prosecution presented its case methodically and devastatingly. They began with the timeline. They showed how Christina had started secretly accumulating debt about 2 years prior, how she had met her accomplice, a man named Edward Sanchez, at a social event 18 months ago, how they had begun an extramarital affair that quickly turned into a criminal conspiracy, how Edward, who had a history of financial crimes, had suggested the plan to eliminate Michael and take his assets. The evidence was presented one by one. The purchase records of substances from compounding pharmacies, the insurance policy taken out without Michael's real knowledge of its value and sole beneficiary, the consultations with law firms about succession and inheritance, the text messages between Christina and Edward recovered from their seized cell phones, where they openly discussed the plan's progress and their anticipation for when they would finally have access to the money. Each piece of evidence was a stab. Michael listened to it all, seeing his private life exposed in the most brutal way possible. But the worst was when they played the recordings. Christina's voice on the phone, complaining that Michael was taking longer than expected to deteriorate completely. The coldness with which she discussed speeding up the process, the way she treated his life as an inconvenient obstacle to be removed. Hearing that in the silence of the courtroom, with dozens of people present, was one of the most painful experiences Michael had ever had. When it was his turn to testify, Michael walked to the witness stand with trembling legs. He swore to tell the truth and began to recount his experience. He spoke about the symptoms he had developed, the mental confusion, the fatigue, the feeling of losing control of himself. He spoke about how Christina had been overly solicitous, overly controlling, always insisting he eat everything she prepared. He spoke about the trip to the Berkshires and how, for the first time in months, he had felt human again. The defense tried to attack him during cross-examination. They asked about his work hours, suggested he emotionally neglected his wife. Michael answered honestly, yes, he worked a lot. Yes, he sometimes came home late, but he had never been cruel, never cheated, never given Christina a reason to doubt his commitment to the marriage, and even if he had, nothing justified attempted murder. Henry was masterful in the redirect examination. He asked precise questions that dismantled every attempt by the defense to create an alternative narrative. When the defense tried to suggest the substances found were just benign supplements, Henry presented 3 toxicology experts who explained in technical detail how those substances, when combined in the proportions found in Michael's system, were unequivocally toxic and potentially lethal. Helen's testimony was particularly impactful. She recounted with impressive calm how she had noticed something was wrong, how she had investigated, how she had literally saved her son's life. The way she described the moment she switched the plates during lunch and felt the effects of the poisoned food caused a stir in the courtroom. Several people on the jury were visibly moved. Helen didn't cry, didn't dramatize. She just stated the facts with a dignity that made it all the more powerful. Edward Sanchez, the accomplice, tried to downplay his role. He claimed he had been manipulated by Christina, that she was the one who really wanted Michael dead, that he had only offered advice without fully understanding what she planned to do. But the text messages between them told a different story. They showed Edward as the architect of the plan, suggesting the specific substances to use, calculating the time needed for the symptoms to seem like a natural progression of an illness. He was not a victim. He was a calculating criminal who had found in Christina a partner willing to kill for money. When it was Christina's turn to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. She walked to the witness stand with measured steps. Her lawyer had clearly coached her on a strategy. Christina cried, apologized, said she had made a terrible mistake, that she was desperate, that the debts had pushed her to the edge. She tried to explain that she never would have actually let Michael die, that at some point she would have stopped, that it was all a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But when the prosecution began to question her, the facade started to crack. They asked direct questions about specific messages, about concrete actions. Christina tried to evade, but each vague answer was met with irrefutable evidence. When confronted with the message where she explicitly said she was impatient for Michael to finally be gone and that the insurance money would be the start of her new life, Christina couldn't deny or contextualize it. There it was, in her own words, the proof of her murderous intent. The trial lasted 5 intense days. Each day, Michael left emotionally exhausted. Helen would take him home, make tea, and sit with him in silence. There were no adequate words for what they were going through, just the constant presence, the unconditional love of a mother who would not let her son face this alone. On the 5th day, after the closing arguments from both sides, the jury retired to deliberate. Henry had explained that the deliberation process could take hours or even days. Michael waited in the courthouse hallway, unable to leave, unable to do anything but wait. Helen stayed by his side, holding his hand, offering the silent strength she had always offered. It took 7 hours, 7 hours in which Michael lived every minute like an eternity. When the jury finally returned and everyone was called back into the courtroom, his heart was beating so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Christina was pale, her hands clenched on the table. Edward maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed his fear. The jury foreman stood up. He read the verdict in a clear, firm voice. Christina Souza Thompson, guilty of attempted first-degree murder, guilty of fraud, guilty of conspiracy. Edward Sanchez, guilty of the same crimes as a co-conspirator. The silence that followed was broken by a sob. Christina had started to cry, not the performative tears she had shed during her testimony, but the genuine sobs of someone who had just understood that her life as she knew it was over. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s, announced that sentencing would take place in a week, but he already indicated the gravity with which he viewed the case. He said that trust within a marriage was sacred, that betraying that trust in the way Christina had was one of the most severe violations he could imagine, that she had not only tried to kill, but had psychologically and physically tortured a man who trusted her completely. A week later, the sentence was delivered. Christina was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Edward received 15 years. Both could still appeal, but with the strength of the evidence and the severity of the crimes, the chances of reversal were minimal. Michael listened to the sentence without showing emotion. He felt no joy or satisfaction, just a profound exhaustion and a sense of closure. That chapter finally was ending. In the months following the sentencing, Michael truly began to rebuild his life. He sold the townhouse in Tribeca. He could no longer be in that space without feeling the toxic presence of everything that had happened. There, he bought a new apartment in the West Village, in a modern building with a view of the park. It was smaller than the previous house, more functional, without the weight of painful memories in every room. Slowly, he allowed himself to socialize again. He accepted invitations to dinners with friends, started frequenting some of the places he used to enjoy. He discovered that the world hadn't stopped while he was fighting to survive. People were still living, laughing, making plans, and he could be a part of that again. But the process wasn't linear. There were nights he woke up in a cold sweat, having nightmares about Christina serving him poisoned food. There were moments when he unintentionally distrusted people's intentions, looking for ulterior motives where there probably were none. The betrayal had left invisible scars that took time to heal. Helen noticed these moments, the days when Michael was more withdrawn, more suspicious. She didn't push, just stayed nearby, reminding him with her presence that not everyone was Christina, That genuine kindness still existed in the world. In one of his sessions with Dr. Martin, his therapist, Michael confessed that he sometimes felt guilty for allowing himself to be happy again, as if by moving on, he was minimizing the gravity of what had happened. Dr. Martin explained that this was common in trauma victims, but that moving on wasn't forgetting. It was honoring the second chance he had been given, that Christina had tried to take his life, and living fully was the best revenge, the best way to prove she hadn't won. Therapy remained essential. His psychologist, Dr. Martin, a woman in her 50s with deep empathy, helped him process not only the trauma of the poisoning, but also deeper issues of trust, vulnerability, and identity. Michael realized he had spent his life building emotional walls, believing that control and self-sufficiency were synonymous with strength. The experience with Christina had brutally demolished those walls, but it had also created an opportunity to rebuild in a healthier way. A year after the trial, on a fall afternoon in New York, Michael invited Helen to lunch at a restaurant she loved in the meatpacking district. During the meal, he said something she would never forget. He said that despite everything, despite the pain and trauma, he had learned something valuable. He had learned that strength didn't come from never falling, but from having the courage to get back up. That true love wasn't blind, but was the willingness to see someone completely and choose them anyway. And that family wasn't just blood, but was the person who stood by your side when everything fell apart. Helen listened with tears in her eyes. She told her son she was proud not only that he had survived, but of the way he had chosen to live after surviving. That it would have been easy to shut himself off completely, to become bitter, to distrust everyone. But he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to grow from the pain, not shrink from it. That same year, something unexpected happened. Michael met someone. He wasn't looking, wasn't ready to look, but life had its own plans. She was an architect named Laura, who was working on one of his company's projects. She was 43, divorced for 5 years with a teenage daughter. She was direct, sincere, with a dry sense of humor that made Michael laugh genuinely for the first time in a long time. He was honest with her from the beginning. He told her about Christina, about the trial, about the trauma. He expected her to run, for it to be too much for someone who barely knew him. But Laura simply listened and then said that everyone carried scars, that his didn't define him, that she was interested in who he was now, not who he had been married to. When Helen met Laura, she immediately felt something was different. It wasn't Christina's performative sophistication. It was a quiet authenticity, a person comfortable in her own skin, who didn't need to impress or manipulate. And most importantly, when Laura looked at Michael, there was genuine care. In her eyes, but not pity. There was respect for his journey, but not an attempt to save or fix him. Helen silently approved, but decided to keep her distance, to let them find their own way. The relationship progressed slowly. Michael had learned that rushing things, skipping steps, ignoring red flags in the name of romance, was a recipe for disaster. Laura respected that. They got to know each other for real before committing. They talked about values, expectations, fears, and hopes. They built a solid foundation of friendship before allowing it to become something deeper. 2 years after the trial, on a starry night at Laura's country house in upstate New York, Michael realized something surprising. He was happy. Not in the naive, unconscious way he had been before, but in a deeper, more conscious way. Happy knowing that life was fragile, that people could disappoint, that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, and yet happy to be alive, to have people he loved, to have purpose and hope. Helen watched her son's transformation with a full heart. She had fulfilled her most important mission, not just saving his life physically, but helping him find the will to truly live after everything. Now at 68, she felt she could finally relax, knowing that Michael would be okay, that he had found not just survival, but the possibility of genuine happiness. One Sunday afternoon, mother and son were together in Michael's new apartment. Laura was there too, baking a cake in the kitchen, with a naturalness that showed the space was already familiar to her. Michael looked at his mother and said, his voice full of emotion, that he wanted her to know something. He wanted her to know that every day he lived, every moment of joy he experienced, every plan he made for the future, all of it existed because she had been vigilant when he couldn't be, because she had trusted her instincts when everyone said it was paranoia, because she had had the courage to act when acting was the hardest and riskiest thing to do. Helen hugged her son. She said she would do it all again without hesitation whenever necessary, because that's what a mother's love meant. It wasn't just celebrating in the good times, but fighting fiercely in the bad. It wasn't just nurturing, but also protecting even when protection required difficult decisions and brave actions. That night, as the three of them had dinner together, there was a sense of peace that Michael hadn't known was possible after all he had been through. It wasn't the peace of ignorance, but the peace of someone who had walked through hell and emerged on the other side, transformed but with his essence intact. It was the peace of knowing the worst storms had passed, and that he had people by his side who would remain regardless of the storms yet to come. Christina was serving her sentence in a prison in New York. Michael learned through Henry that she had tried to get in touch a few times, sending letters asking for forgiveness, for a chance to explain. He never read the letters. He asked that they be returned unopened. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. Some bridges, once burned, needed to stay that way. Some people didn't deserve second chances, especially when they had deliberately tried to end your life. Forgiveness was something Michael was still processing. His therapist said that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or reconciling, but freeing oneself from the weight of hatred. Michael understood this intellectually, but emotionally he still struggled. Maybe one day he would reach a point where he could forgive Christina, not for her sake but for his own. But that day hadn't come yet, and that was okay. What had come was the ability to trust again, not blindly. He would never be blind again, but to trust consciously, choosing to believe in people based on their consistent actions, not just their words. Laura had proven, day after day, that she was worthy of that trust, and Michael was learning that allowing himself to be vulnerable again wasn't weakness. It was the greatest form of courage. 3 years after the trial, Michael was in his office when he received an unexpected call. It was from the prison, where Christina was serving her sentence. She had attempted suicide during the night. She was in the prison hospital, in serious but stable condition. They were calling because legally he was still her next of kin. Michael heard the information with a wave of complex emotions. He felt no joy or satisfaction. He felt a deep sadness for the waste of it all, for how Christina's choices had destroyed not only his life but her own as well. He didn't go to visit her. He informed them that he did not wish to be contacted about her health status unless it was legally required. He knew this might seem cruel to some, but he also knew he had the right to protect his own peace of mind. Christina had made choices that led to consequences. He was not responsible for saving her from them. Laura was with him when he got the news. She didn't judge his decision not to visit, didn't try to convince him one way or the other. She just asked how he was feeling and was present while he processed it. It was this quality in her that Michael valued most, the ability to be present without trying to fix, to accept his decisions without judgment. The years continued to pass. Michael thrived professionally, expanding his business, but always maintaining a healthy work-life balance. He learned that success wasn't just about numbers in bank accounts, but about quality of life, meaningful relationships, moments of genuine joy. Helen aged gracefully, maintaining her independence but always present in her son's life. Laura became a true partner, someone with whom Michael could imagine growing old. One December evening, 5 years after the trial, Michael and Laura were sitting on the balcony of his apartment, watching the lights of New York below. He held her hand and thought about how strange and unpredictable life was. How 5 years ago he was literally dying, poisoned by the person he trusted most. And now he was here, healthy, happy, with someone by his side who loved him in a healthy and true way. He told Laura he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. It wasn't a formal proposal with a ring and on one knee. It was just honest declaration of intent. Laura smiled, squeezed his hand and said she wanted that too, that they would build something new together, based on honesty, respect, and genuine love. It wouldn't be perfect because nothing human was, but it would be real, and that was all that mattered. When Helen found out, she cried with joy, not because she thought Michael needed someone else to be complete, but because she saw that he had regained not just his life, but the ability to live it fully. He had walked through the darkness and found light on the other side, and that light didn't come from without, but from within himself, from his strength, his resilience, his choice not to let one person's evil destroy his capacity for goodness. And so, the story that had begun with betrayal and poison ended with healing and hope. Michael learned that survival wasn't enough, that one had to have the courage to live after surviving. Helen learned that a mother's love could literally save lives, that trusting maternal instincts wasn't paranoia, but profound wisdom. And together they learned that family was what remained when everything else fell apart, that it was the hand that held on when the ground disappeared, that it was the light that guided you back when the darkness threatened to consume you. New York City continued to pulse below, indifferent to the personal tragedies and triumphs of its millions of inhabitants. But for Michael, each light in that city now represented a possibility, not a threat. It represented life, continuity, a future. And he was ready to embrace it all, knowing that no matter what came, he wouldn't be alone. He would have his mother, he would have Laura, he would have himself stronger and wiser than ever before. The story of Michael and Helen was a story about the hidden dangers that can exist in the most unlikely places, about how not all danger comes with a warning, about how sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who share our table and our bed. But it was also a story about vigilance, about the power of a mother's love, about the strength that comes from facing the worst and still choosing to believe in the best. And as night fell over New York, Michael Thompson, a man who had been nearly destroyed but had emerged transformed, looked to the future not with fear but with hope, because he had learned the most important lesson of all, that life, however fragile and uncertain, is worth living. Always. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Michael, Helen, and the courage of a mother who saved her son has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of survival, betrayal, and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you most in this story. Every day we bring you intense narratives like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, the silent battles we fight and the strength we find when all seems lost. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the complexity of human relationships.